In this video, I'll talk about what it means to present a theory of everything, or what it means to explain everything. Because necessarily, any theory will be unable to explain absolutely everything in the sense of answering all possible questions. And it's quite useful to understand why that is the case. It has to do with what it means to explain or what it means to understand something. Because if we want to explain something or understand something, then we integrate it into a larger context. For instance, you're wondering about what is a spark plug, and I can explain it and you can understand it if we see that it fits into a motor in a car. Or you're wondering why does this apple fall to the ground, and then we can integrate it in a larger theory of gravity, and we can understand why apples fall to the ground. And if you then ask questions to a theory about why is this the case, then the theory will be able to explain for a while, but in the end, if you continue asking why, then it will come to an end, and it will just have to say this is the case, this is how it is, these are the fundamental building blocks in this theory, and now this theory can't explain anything more. So for instance, I can explain a spark plug by putting in a motor. I can put the motor in the car, I can put the car in the world and talk about electricity and gravity, etc. But if you keep asking why, then at some point the theory is unable to answer any further why questions. And so that will be the case for any theory then. It will come to some final endpoints, and if you needed to explain those, you would have to integrate that theory into an even larger theory. But since that can continue forever, then no theory will be able to explain everything. The exception would be if there were some self-explanatory, sort of obvious, anyone can understand why it had to be like this, but we have no reason to think that there are these self-explanatory basic building blocks. So it will be the case that any theory will have some questions that they can't answer, but on the other hand, a theory could hypothetically explain almost everything, and of course it's a goal to try to explain as much as possible. If we then take a look at current theories about everything, because there are quite many of them on the market, we notice something interesting. It is that all of them will say that here are some things that cannot be explained, but they use different building blocks as their fundamental entities. So some will say these things can't be explained, but we can use them to explain everything else. And others will say these things can't be explained, but we can use them to explain everything else. But they are different things. And what's even more interesting is that when some people say this is primitive, this is a concept that cannot be defined or cannot be explained further, others will say, oh yes, we can explain those. And yet others will say, well, the thing you're talking about, it doesn't exist at all. So, for example, some will say that causes and effects, that's a sort of fundamental relation that cannot be explained, whereas others will say, oh, we can explain causation. That just means that there's a transfer of energy, or that one state of affair make another more probable, etc. And yet others will say that there is no such thing as causation, because the laws of physics, they apply both directions in time. It's more random connections that we call cause and effect. Or concerning consciousness, some will say that it's a fundamental part of the world that cannot be explained. Others will say we can explain consciousness, it's just about integration of information in the brain or something. And others will say there is no such thing as consciousness, it's just an illusion. And so on with laws of nature, with free will, with particles, with time. Some will say it exists and can't be defined, others says we can explain it, and yet others say it doesn't exist at all, it's just an illusion. So here are some examples, a long list of things that some will say this is basic building blocks, cannot be defined, cannot be explained, but can be used to explain everything else. Others will say we can explain it, and yet others will say it doesn't exist at all. So what should we do in such a situation with so much disagreement? Well, it would be a goal then to see how few of these unexplained building blocks can we manage with, in order then to explain everything else. Because when someone says this cannot be explained, it might be true, because as we saw, any theory will have something that cannot be explained. But on the other hand, we should be skeptical when someone says this cannot be explained, because it might just be the case that the theory has run out of resources and is unable to explain. Could be a problem with the theory. And of course, it's a quite simple solution. If you have a theory and there's something you can't explain, and to say, well, this is unexplainable, might be true, but if other people say we can explain it, or it doesn't even need explanation, it's worth looking around to see if there are better options on the table. So the goal then would be to have as few unexplained building blocks as possible in order to be able to answer as many questions as possible, which you can then use to explain everything else. And of course, those building blocks should then be quite precise and understandable. If you just have some vague, big concepts that you can use to explain everything, but we don't understand how it works, then it's not very helpful. If I just say everything can be explained by yin and yang, and every time you have a question, I say, well, that's because of yin or that's because of yang, but I can't say anything more about yin and yang, then that's not a good theory. So it needs to be a quite detailed and precise theory about the basic building blocks and how you can combine those into explaining everything else. So in the theory I'm going to present now, I'm going to say that everything can be reduced to 3 basic building blocks, and that I can explain everything else by combining these 3 in different ways. And what are those? One more thing to say first. I will be arguing also that there are really many problems in philosophy and science that are not really problems in the world, but problems that are caused by the concepts that we use to understand the world. So if we come to see the problem with the concepts and their lack of precision, etc., we can also dissolve or solve the problem with better terms. So I'm going to argue that in fact, a lot of problems can be solved by framing or by using the terminology in the theory that I will present. So I'll translate the problems into more precise problems, and then going to argue that all things in the world can be reduced down to 3 things, and I cannot explain those, but I can use those to explain everything else. And what are then the 3 things? Well, as an easy introduction, I'm going to say that we need a place where something can happen, and we need something that creates change, and we need subjectivity, that something can be understood as something for someone. We need this I'm going to say that in quite basic ways, and then use it to understand more details on subjectivity and mind, on changes that happen, etc. But I need there will be some fundamental things there that I cannot explain. In a little more complicated terms, I'm going to say that we need a field, we need values, and we need an actualizer, and I'm going to explain all that later. And then you might wonder, well, why do we have then these 3 things? And in the end of the book and in the end of the video series, I will also try an explanation of why something exists at all. But that must be something you'll have to look forward to. So this is the end of this video.